Hi, Onyi, and welcome to the Dark Night of the Soul Unwrapped.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, what was happening in your life around the time your Dark Night of the Soul began?
I was out of college. It was my third job out of college. And at the time, I was struggling with feelings of being professionally competent. And this third job felt almost karmic in a way. It made me face all of the doubts that I had about myself. The reason it was my third job is because I had gotten let go of the first two, in what at the time felt a confusing way. I wasn't sure what I did wrong. I wasn't able to get feedback. It was the first time since graduating from school, after being in school for so long, that there was no clear feedback mechanism for growth. And this third job made me face myself in many ways. One, my own shadows, my own mistakes, myself, as well as confirmed in a way a lot of doubts I had of myself and a lot of fears and suspicions. And I would say that my dark night of the soul kind of started when I was still in it, but really became clear once COVID happened. Many were let go at that time. And so this was the third time that happened, even though this time wasn't technically my fault. So much had happened there that made me have to really reevaluate the foundations of myself.
What happened in that reevaluating of the foundations? What did that look like?
It's a really good question. It really made me reevaluate how I saw myself. I didn't have a very good self concept or wasn't aligned with reality. Um, I had grown up pretty sheltered, and that environment really exposed me to so much of my own deficiencies that I had to face the truth, which was that my self concept, my perception and perspective of the world and the reality were very far apart. I had up until then, for example, thought that people were generally good and generally trying their best to be good, including myself. And so when faced with that, people weren't, and that a lot of people are not the best. I initially kind of fell into this victim role of like, look at me, I'm just trying to be a good person and I'm such a bright soul into this world and all these bad people exist. But then I had to also recognize, wait a minute, you're not this bright, sweet soul like you think you are either. And that was the sort of initial cracks of like, how are you lying to yourself? And how is that lie contributing to negativity in your life?
How were you lying to yourself?
I was lying to myself about a lot of things because, like I said, the first two jobs that I had after college, I got let go and it felt confusing at the time. And although upon re-examining now that I'm older, I see the professional mishandling on the part of the employers, I also see my immaturity and my own overconfidence and recklessness and naivete going into the professional space that really made me have to face what felt like whispers in the back of my mind initially became louder and louder of like, you're contributing to this. See, this isn't just happening to you. You're not this passive victim where things are happening to you and it's just so confusing and you just don't know why the world is out to get you. You're contributing significantly to the bad things that seem to be happening to you, even though it is being done by not the best people and being done not the best way. It made me really have to face because at the time I really thought I was so mature and that I understood things and that I was so aware, and I wasn't. I really was not. It's a bruise to the ego. And I think of my ego then as being um mal maldeveloped, let's say. Like I felt like it was artificially inflated because I didn't it wasn't aligned with the reality. So it was a false confidence that, even at certain points I was like, why couldn't people just like reach out to me and help me if they could see that I was just making these mistakes? Why couldn't people just be honest with me? But I now understand, I mean, why would they? Why would they help someone who seems like they seem to know it all? They seem to know how to proceed, and they move with that. Who would want to help someone like that? And being honest with yourself about those things, how your ego is not rooted in reality, can really shatter a lot of what for me at the time was the foundation of who I thought I was.
Yeah, and there's so much in what you just said. That was also my experience. And just to say, I think there's something really important in this about immaturity and maturity, which in my experience doesn't have very much to do with actual physical age.
No.
I would say that likewise for me, that whole period was about the shattering of my self-concept and who I took myself to be, and seeing, as you said, the immaturity and the naivety within all of that, including the perception of myself as a particular kind of victim. And I think it's important to get the nuance in this, isn't it? Because it isn't that I don't think we're talking about the sort of the way that a victim mentality is often spoken about, say in New Age circles. There's a seeing of the reality of where we have actually been the victims of something, and where there's a kind of doing it to ourselves, or a seeing ourselves in a particular position that's, as you said, is sort of a lying to ourselves. And I love what you said about the whispers, because those whispers, in my experience, are different to the kind of superego critical voice. There's something very different to that. What was your sense of the whispers?
It felt more, as opposed to the critical voice that just tells you you're bad and everything you do is the worst. This these whispers came through via confirmation. For example, I would have a situation that something would happen and I would be like, that was confusing, that was weird. And then maybe a quick whisper would be like, well, maybe you didn't handle that the best way. And that's because, and like I would have a quick sort of answer to, but then I was like, wait, well, it can't be that, because then I would have to then come to grips with the reality of so much of what mistakes I had made before. And so it was kind of those whispers that are edging you towards the truth of something that you're trying to avoid. Um, but the difficulty is that it's hard to tell the difference between that and the critical voice in the moment. In hindsight, I can say, well, yeah, it's because the situation confirmed this, and that's why I was, unaware of that. But in the moment, it just felt like the same critical voice, and so it was easy to ignore.
Yeah, because my sense of it is that so much of that ego structure is about trying to fend all of that off, right? I mean, it's desperately trying to hold to its own self-concept, isn't it? Sort of against anything else, from either from outside or from within. And you talked about the cracks that started to appear. How were they? What were they like?
I can speak probably better to it in hindsight, but in the moment, the cracks formed through real day-to-day confirmation. So, when you're in your head and you live in a different version of the truth, You're like, well, I'm this type of person. And so when given the real life opportunity to present that person, I will succeed. I think it was really notable for me that it was happening through the context of work. And this being the third time I was finding myself in problematic dynamics, my logical brain, which naturally scans for patterns and facts, was clearly seeing like, okay, there's some incongruence with your self concept and like what the result is by these like real life examples of me failing, being misunderstood, me misunderstanding things. But there was still a version of me, that version of me that was like, no, but it's because I'm being misunderstood. It's because they just don't see me. It's because them, there was this just discomfort. I remembered I can feel in hindsight that I was uncomfortable all the time. And I misunderstood that discomfort. I thought maybe I'm just anxious, maybe I'm overwhelmed, maybe I'm just struggling. But it was actually an internal incongruence that was starting to manifest itself that I could no longer ignore.
The word incongruence seems really important in this. And
Yeah.
it's interesting. My work life was fine, but it was a whole pattern of relationships. So my sphere in which that was manifesting itself was trying to do the same thing over and over again. And of course, a similar pattern where somehow it was something to do with them. And maybe there was some, I would let in the idea that I was bad at making those sorts of choices, but not really take it further than that for all the reasons you just described, that there's something here trying to keep itself intact. And I think that incongruence just starts to get more and more difficult to hold.
Yeah. And then what I found was then something in you that wants to keep that version alive starts fighting more and more. So where initially was this like discomfort, this incongruence, I found for me the next phase was this like fighting bitterly to maintain that self concept. So whether it was demonizing people, whether it was, you know, ostracizing myself from certain groups or just framing a reality where I was just this poor soul who was just being misunderstood was my first defensive armor that luckily dismantled because at the end of the day, what overrid my system was my desire to be like rooted in the truth. And there was a point where my logical, truth seeking brain could no longer deny the reality of the situation. And at first, I didn't really parse it out well. I just then framed myself the other way around as like, oh, you're the worst. Like, you can't trust yourself. You've been wrong all along. Like, everything you think is not true. Like, I really just regressed so far back in myself once it became apparent to me that I had been wrong about who I thought I was. I became this awful person to myself instead, which was also not the answer either, but it was a way for me to cope with this new reality.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it, how it flips? I mean, I had something a little similar in the sense that before my dark night started or before I was aware of it beginning, I think that fighting was happening unconsciously. And there was a kind of brittleness to that. A brittleness is a good word for it, I think, a sort of a hardness in the defensiveness of that
Yeah.
armor. And then I think for me, when that, as it were, quotes failed, and the thing flips round, and then we're seeing everything that's been kept at bay by that mechanism. That likewise felt like a huge catastrophe. Like, oh, I'm just this awful mess of shame, yeah, kind of awfulness. And now it's exposed. Now the world is going to see it.
I think that's the key part. And the biggest piece of the shame for me was, oh, I've been walking around so blind this whole time. Everyone's been able to see it this whole time. And you feel so deeply ashamed of walking around like a fool. Uh, and for me, it happened in the series of like realizations. I would have realizations of certain situations that happened and seeing it from this new perspective and be like, it was just things would replay in my mind of like moments where I was wrong. And I thought about all the, the things that happened to me in the city, both personally and professionally up until then, like my first two jobs and this third one and everything that had happened. Like I just received so much information once the floodgates of this realization opened. I kind of just was almost paralyzed by it. I think I went through a period of time of just, yeah, being paralyzed and ashamed and hating myself a bit almost for it.
I think that's an inevitable part of this, isn't it? I mean, it always amazes me how the language that comes or the metaphors that come are so similar, aren't they? Words like floodgates, or for me, there was a really strong thing at the beginning about the dam bursting,
Yeah.
and a very similar kind of imagery, and absolutely that paralysis. I mean, for me, I couldn't really function at all. I mean, I couldn't work, and being able to do anything was quite minimal. And looking back at that now, my sense is that, as you just said, so much of that paralysis was the shame and self-hatred that had always been there, but not been conscious.
Exactly. Like that's kind of, where because then I think about like before that, before this unraveling happened, I very much lived in this false reality that also hurt me. Because in this false reality, I wasn't achieving the results that I was hoping for, my intentions were hoping for. And so I was hurting in that way of feeling deeply misunderstood and feeling out of control. And then as things are unraveling, I felt this like internal incongruence of my thinking brain kind of seeing what's going on, but then my mind and my body not wanting to come to terms with this. So I was suffering in a different way. But then, yeah, once I realized everything, although so intensely painful, was my first step towards freedom. I now recognize in hindsight because I was no longer lying to myself. I was starting to see the patterns and how I contributed to it. I was starting to see what I rested my whole sense of self and ego on were not real. Um, and so, yeah, I was always suffer. You always, until you are honest with yourself and you go through this ego dissolution that becomes this dark night of the soul, you are also suffering. Even if it may not feel the same way and the same intensity, you're suffering in terms of like the outcomes of your life and how your false concept is framing things that still frames you as being hurt by the world, you know?
Yeah, I think there's something really important about those two different kinds of pain. That pain that comes, as you say, when you're living in that false reality and that false self-concept is, I think, partly the pain that's kind of leaking through the floodgates in some way, but also the pain of having to hold that false reality in place, to keep all of that down and to keep these sorts of positions in things, isn't it? Like you say, certainly being misunderstood was one of mine. All of the different positions that we have to hold, whether they feel sort of good or bad. One of the things that I saw quite early on, one of the self-concepts that fell apart was seeing this idea of being clever, having to be clever. There's a fixity to those self-concepts, isn't it? I have to be this or I have to not be this. And just the strain of the effort, the tension
Yeah.
involved in holding all of that, I mean, it's just so exhausting ultimately.
I love that you point to the exhaustion because a part of the result of the floodgates and the activation of this like core meat potatoes was burnout. I had spent so much effort in the dying breaths of my previous self concept leaning on things that I felt like I knew for sure. Like I'm really smart and I'm hardworking. And so I over compensated for that, you know. I know for my first job out of college, I was working as a legal assistant, and I was working weekends, I was working overtime, I was putting in a lot of effort. And when that wasn't enough, being clever and being hardworking, I just felt like I remember when I was let go, I was walking outside. I kind of initially asked, what did I do wrong? And the answer was just you made mistakes. You made mistakes. And I'm walking out of the building and I'm bawling my eyes out. I'm like shaking, crying. I'm not seeing the full picture yet, but I just feel so sorry and so bad for myself that I had, and then of course you tell yourself the story of like, oh my gosh, they took advantage of me. Like I did my best. I worked so hard. Like, how could they? Um, and then I started to think of like little things like, okay, like how were you maybe not the most mature? Okay, how were you not presenting yourself in this way? And yes, it was harsh how they approached it, but like, how would you see this if it wasn't framed under this, you're this victim, this poor innocent, could do no harm person? Um, but yeah, I mean, you over max out, like overly max out on your strengths to share exhaustion, because the reality is that you're putting a lot of effort into the wrong thing, actually.
Absolutely. There's a couple of things here that feel really important. One is what you just said about expending all of that effort in the wrong thing. Some years later, I got the phrase, been barking up the wrong tree. So there was all that effort in the barking, and then suddenly going like, oh my God, this was never the place for all of that effort. Yeah, the exhaustion and the burnout of that. But also this sense of there being, in a sense, coming down into a deeper sense of reality. Because as
Yes.
you said, on the one hand, the reality was you were dealt with harshly when you were let go, and there were whatever issues there were going on there. And this other deeper reality that had been being defended against or ignored in some way. And I think there's something about the dropping into that as the floodgates open that is both, I think, initially really shocking, and for me had some kind of sense of relief in it. There was some sense of like, well, even if I wanted to hold all of this together, I just can't, because the dam's burst, right? I mean, the floodgates have opened.
Yeah, and I love what you said about deepening reality, because I very starkly remember that I thought very black and white back then, because if I wasn't a good person, then I must be bad. That was the alternative. And that's why I think my self-concept fought so hard to stay, because if it went away, then that would mean that I was a bad person. And that's what I thought for a long time. I was like, well, if I'm not this good person, then I must be this bad person. But what going through the process helped me understand is that that duality doesn't really exist. That it's much more complicated than that. There's so many different factors. And, but I think at the beginning, a very rigid concept falls, it only makes sense that what precedes is the opposite of what you were thinking. You're like, oh, I'm the strong person. You artificially, for example, frame yourself as a strong, reliable person, for example, and then that self concept falls apart. Then you tell yourself, well, I must not be strong or reliable. I must actually be the worst. And you do need to push through that part of thinking, oh, if it's not this, and it must be that, because we're much more complicated than that. Situations are much more complicated than that. I think for a while I started just blaming myself. I was like, I'm the worst. I had these three careers or jobs, and I did a terrible job, and I was the worst, and I lied to myself, and I was this, awful thing. And then years later, I was kind of like, okay, well, there's a lot more nuance to this. Like, yes, you were treated badly. Yes, it was a weird place, but also you were immature and young and naive and didn't know what to expect. And yes, you made mistakes because of it. That doesn't mean you're a horrible person. Fair enough. You know what I mean? That does happen, but you also didn't leave yourself really open to grow and change. People did try to maybe give you advice here and there, and you weren't open sort of you weren't someone that left themselves open to it. And so seeing yourself as flawed, but not horrible or bad or whatever awful extreme you want to go to.
Absolutely. I think that whole point about binary thinking, that rigid, fixed, polarized thinking is so important. And as we know, that's kind of endemic in our culture. And to see, as you said, that actually the seeing of that nuance takes some time. It's almost like you have to know both ends of those poles to, I think, to really see that, to see that there's so many things that we ascribe morality to in a way. You know, I think for me there was something in the seeing also that suffering wasn't a question of moral deficiency, but neither was suffering conferring some sort of moral goodness either. Yeah, is there anything else that comes to you about the binary of this? Because that does feel
Yeah.
really important.
I think it also helped me, navigate other people too, because people were either good or bad, and I was either good or bad, and situations were either good or bad. And so once my self concept fell apart, where I initially was like, well, I'm just the worst then. Um, and then working through that and getting to a point of like, okay, what's the solution? Do I just hate myself forever? Am I just then the worst person ever? Like, what's the other option there is not being here anymore. And that wasn't something that I like. Once I got to that point, I was like, okay, something's got to give. And so I got therapy, and it was through that work that and rebuilding myself as not this perfect human being that's all sunshine and roses and that could do no wrong, but someone who has developed strategies through trauma to survive. And so that meant being unconsciously manipulative in some cases, being defensive and closed off to feedback or to help, while simultaneously needing a lot of help. Um, being kind of someone that portrays themselves very differently from how they feel or what they would need, helped me understand, okay, I'm this complex person who has developed this way because of that. So are other people, but then that means also so are situations. And it helped me then start to rewrite and reframe a lot of things. Um, it was definitely healthier for me to first develop this like, okay, like as we're rebuilding who we are from this ego death, for lack of a better word, um, let's rebuild it from a place of rooted in the truth. And the truth was a lot more complicated than what my fragile ego could handle. My previously fragile ego could handle.
Yeah, I want to talk more about uh, egos and their fragility and their dissolution or death. Just to say, I love what you just said about starting to see when all of the old self-concept had fallen apart, beginning to see like, oh, so much of this is about trauma and trauma strategies,
Yeah.
and being able to understand our moves, our all of our defenses, all of that from that perspective, I think makes such a huge difference. And for me, took, obviously over a long period of time, started to really, really reduce the shame and the self-hatred. Because then
Yeah.
I think then it becomes a question of seeing these things and going, oh, that's that, in a much more accepting, understanding way. That makes a huge difference, because I think even though before my dark night, I'd had therapy at various points, my sense is that it isn't really until that dissolution happens that any really deep work begins. And I know that if I'd heard me say that before my dark night, I would have been saying, but I've done, my work has been really deep. But I think by definition, until those floodgates open, the floodgates are locked. And I think there's a limit to, even with the best will in the world and the good practitioners, I think there's a real limit to where we can go because that structure has kept itself intact. I think it isn't until that crack, those first cracks appear, that we can really begin to see what you were just talking about in terms of the trauma strategies and all of those
Yeah,
mechanisms.
100%. I mean, I think that, I think it's what you just said about how you had done therapy before, but you didn't have this dark night process or this ego dissolution. And so you weren't really able to get to the work. I think this is something that people don't talk enough about. With therapy being more of a conversation, popularized conversation, people are not as shy about or as embarrassed about talking about going to a mental health professional. It's become more in vogue. I think that what people don't also talk about is not just, how much therapy is really doing the work and facing it, but also you can therapize all day, every day. If you haven't faced yourself and been honest with yourself, then you're going to inevitably lie to the therapist, lie to yourself. You're just going these sessions, you know, padding around the surface level of what you need to work on. And it also explains why therapy is so accessible to so many people, but we're still all very problematic. I think there needs to be, I think that before you even go to therapy and get a mental health professional, to probably have a bit of an eco dissolution first. Otherwise, you're unintentionally going under false pretenses and can make you more problematic, actually, because now you have the language, now you have the framing to seem a certain way that you're like, it pads up this false self concept even more.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is something really interesting about how being in that world or having therapy or even being a therapist. I mean, of course, just because you're a therapist doesn't mean you've been through the ego dissolution
Yeah.
bit. My sense is that definitely makes things more problematic, just slightly more sophisticated on one level, and therefore actually a little bit more difficult to sort of get at in a way. And I would say that spirituality, as it's often talked about and practiced, does something similar. Spiritual beliefs, spiritual ideas, I think will often operate in this similar sort of way to be used to bolster that self-concept, because that's what that does, right? I mean, it'll use anything it can get its hands on to keep itself, to perpetuate itself in its own image.
We really don't talk enough about the false ego and as for lack of better terminology then, because that false ego really feeds off of whatever it needs to stay. And until you've had a psychological and almost spiritual breakdown of self, I don't know that you can trust your ego. Yeah, and that's why the dark night of the soul feels the way it does.
Yeah. How did it feel to you? What was the somatic felt sense of it?
It was different things. I mean, I remember one time waking up and feeling like there was so much vertigo, like the world was moving and I couldn't, and I was just like, and then I was just like very kind of like taken aback by it. Um, I remember feeling a lot of like intense energy. Like I would always go for a walk or need to go for a run. I lost a lot of weight at that period of time and just struggling to eat, like losing a lot of interest in things because like I said, it's almost a spiritual, I mean, I guess it is a spiritual process of losing the false ego, because it's your psychological makeup. It's what you believe and even how you frame the world in terms of. It's kind of like if you're someone who grew up pretty with shallow materialistic things, and you base your whole sense of self off of being attractive or being rich, and then you lose all of it. Let's say something happens, you lose your luck, something happens, you lose your money, then you have to like first cope with the loss of something that you thought, well, if you don't have this, then what are you? You're nothing. But then now you realize, okay, I'm nothing now. Where does one go from being nothing? Um, I think that that's then where your life really begins, where the new ego starts to build itself from a new reality that is uh it's like mourning something that died, but it's not a real person. You can't say, well, I'm going to this person's funeral. And a self-concept that died, you that died, but not just something that died, something that never existed that died. Like it wasn't a real person, it wasn't a real thing, it wasn't a real concept. And it's really hard because you really lose trust in yourself and a sense of whether you can be believed. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that mourning, that grieving for it is really complex in a sense, isn't it? Because there is a mourning for it, isn't it? Because it's felt very real. It's felt like this is who I am and that's what we've taken ourselves to be. And certainly I think for me the terror, particularly at the beginning of the Dark Night of the Soul, was I didn't know that I existed in any other form. And so there was a sense of, well, I won't survive this because what's falling apart is me. I'm wondering about this, we've got this sense of ego dissolution, the false ego and the new ego. What's your sense looking back at it now of what it is exactly that's dissolving, the false ego that's dissolving?
Well, it's definitely the illusion because the false ego is the story that you're telling in your head about the world and yourself. And it stays alive as long as it's not challenged enough to be faced with. And I think many of us have some form of narrative in our brain of what we think the world is and who we are. And many of us don't get the privilege, let's just call it that, of it being confronted. But it really is, like I said, something that never really existed or that was really true. But I will say, born from a real moment. I know for myself, my false ego was born from trauma and avoidance and escapism and needing to create a reality that allowed me to like to keep going, instead of facing things. I know from when I was younger, I daydreamed a lot. I was always in my head to kind of avoid the some real life trauma that was happening day to day. So it was definitely a coping skill, a mechanism from survival um that yeah, once reckoned with, really, I mean, I had like kind of like a flashback of a lot of moments from the past of, living in this false ego and how far back it had existed. And I was actually talking to a friend about this recently who's essentially experiencing this right now. And they gave me the language of, mourning something that never existed. And in in their sort of re-examining of how it even came to be, they really trace back to their childhood of survival strategies that made it so that they built this image in this world that was never true. But until something really drastic happens to force us to face it, it's I don't think that many of us will be incentivized to otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, there's really no incentive to.
Yeah.
I mean, from its perspective, it couldn't possibly see what incentive there would be for its own undoing. I'd love what you just said about those moments. I mean, that was exactly my experience, that as the dam burst, there was spontaneously over and over again these moments from the past that would come in fully embodied now. And the seeing of those moments, what had happened both in terms of events in those moments, but actually then what that had done to my structure. what I had to become in order to get through that.
Yes.
And I think my sense now is that for whatever reasons, we couldn't be this, so we had to become that. And then part of being that means not allowing this, the realness of us or the reality of what happened, to start to surface. So part of that false ego is really around keeping that out and keeping its rigidity. I think when we start to see the moments that created it or out of which it was created, the self-hatred and the shame are punctuated with moments of love, moments of kindness.
And understanding. You understand why you became that person. You go from being thinking that you're the worst and you're a bad person and everything that you believed was false to realizing why this even became in the first place. It was really helpful when I was talking to my friend and being like, well, first and foremost, you're a survivor and you survived. You did whatever you needed to do to survive. I think we're primed to do that. You can be upset with yourself with what survival mechanism that you use, even though now you have the ability to take a step back and see it for the truth or the falsity that it was. But yeah, it's really hard at the beginning once your self concept. I mean, it's akin to people who believe a very specific they have a very religious belief, and then it gets, like people that leave cults, for example. I think it's akin to that the same sort of grief that happens when something that you hung your whole life and sacrifices and sense of self and concept shatters. There is a lot of initial grief that is a lot of self-inflicted anger and sadness and pain and frustration that then hopefully becomes gives room for, oh, I understand how I was manipulated or manipulating myself. I understand why I allowed this to happen because how else would I have survived? And it was a strategy for sure, a maladaptive one, but it didn't come from nowhere. You're not this person that just chose to be like this to be a bad person. Yeah.
Completely. I think that's such a great analogy of it being like leaving a cult.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think, a cult that you've been in since you can remember.
Yeah.
That's all you've known. And, it's that what comes to me is the Truman Show.
Yeah.
That moment where
Yeah.
he breaks out of the dome. I think there's absolutely that flavor in this, because when we're in that cult of the false ego, it is our world. We will leave out or push away or resist evidence to the contrary wherever we find it. And so, yeah, in that dissolution, as we've been saying, there's grief, there's terror, there's so many things that come into that. What happened for you around this sense of like, oh, there's something else here as well, this sense of a new ego or sort of green shoots or whatever that was?
I think for me, because at that time, I didn't know why I was intuitively drawn to this, but I started meditating consistently as a way to just cope. I was feeling a lot of emotional distress from realizing all these things about the truth and my false ego and how it wasn't aligned with the reality, and feeling emotionally overwhelmed by it and feeling like, well, okay, I can control this thing, which is managing my mind and managing my thoughts and the heart racing and the panic and the anxiety. And so I meditated consistently for a year, every single day. I even made my friends do it. I had a partner at the time. I kind of made him and his friends do it. I got really focused on, okay, well, I don't know. And let me just do what I've been told is a good way to get to the self and go back within yourself, which is meditate every single day. When talking with my friend who's recently going through it, they gave a really good analogy of like, well, now that I know that the false ego is gone, for lack of a better word, they didn't say it this way, but now that this false ego, I'm aware of it and it no longer works, I want to intentionally rebuild my new ego, knowing that it's like a baby and something to be protected. I didn't have that language to understand that that's what I was doing. But in the moment, I was like, okay, well, that wasn't true. And I can't trust my senses right now. Let's go back to the basics of what we know works. Okay, meditation, really get to know yourself to your core and slow things down. And so in doing that over the year, and it bled into, I think maybe a couple years and it tapered off, I started to really pay attention to what was true and parse out because, the false ego, I don't think is all false. There's some elements of truth to the false ego. Like I was always hardworking and I was smart. Like those things weren't wrong. But that wasn't and that shouldn't be what I rested my sense of self on. And so going back to, okay, what are more stable foundations to rest oneself on? And it really took just experiencing life, meeting people, meditating, leaving myself open to what's right in front of me and facing it head on and not making up a story or adding extra details to it helped me like baby steps rebuild a new sort of ego that took time to grow because I needed evidence of it. I needed time. I even remember after COVID, I started grad school like during the pandemic, and then towards before things kind of went back to normal, quote unquote. I started this job, and in the job, I really like, I was working at a restaurant. I really like held myself back and did not act in the ways I normally would. I was very careful, very mindful, and it was a surprise to me, a few months in, realizing that my coworkers really liked me. They really wanted to get to know me as a person. I wasn't making the same mistakes and faux pas I was before. And surprising myself, like I was getting to know myself again and surprising myself with my actual good qualities and then seeing, okay, like maybe I'm not all bad. And, but then obviously like being very careful and guarded still with making friends. Whenever things would happen that was confusing and that brought me back to my old self, being very harsh about cutting it off and not engaging with it. I think subconsciously, even though I didn't have a language to understand that I was rebuilding a new ego and it was meant to be rebuilt with care, I was doing it. I was doing it that way of like, okay, I don't know. I think I'm the worst. I don't trust my judgment. Let's start from the beginning. What can we touch and feel and smell? Like what is real here? Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think talking about slowing it down and getting really simple is so key. I mean, for me, it was literally like walls, floors,
Yeah.
doors. Like I know that
Yes.
they're solid. And yeah, I love what you described because it feels like a combination of both an uncovering, in the dissolution of the false
Mhm.
self, there's this uncovering of like, oh, like you say, the bits that were actually you and that parsing out of the real from the false, as well as just, yeah, those baby steps of which I totally recognize, I don't really know what this is or how to be in the world, and just sort of stumbling around a bit with that feels like the slowness and knowing that that is about little steps over time and getting the sense or even the scent of like, oh, that's me.
Yes.
Like, oh.
Yeah, you're getting to know yourself again. And you can now, from a place of humility, at least for me, it was that case because I had gotten so sick of myself, for lack of a better word, that I was like, you know what? Like, we don't know. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what's true. We can't really trust our sense and our judgment. Let's rebuild. I remember at the time with my therapist, the analogy I was using was like I was in a raft and I was just trying to stay, afloat. And over the years, we've worked on building this ship that I'm sailing actively. But at the time, I felt like I was just lost at sea, and I finally admitted it that I wasn't okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that image of sailing the ship because then it is dependent on the wind. But the skill is in doing all the things that you need to
Mhm.
do in order to get it to sail, right? Pointing in the direction and sorting out the sails. So it is that blend, isn't it, of both having agency but not mistaking that for something that it isn't.
100%. And I'm of the stern belief that no true work and no true self-work can be done without that radical honesty that then leads to self-management. Like awareness is not enough, knowing yourself is not enough. But kind of like with the analogy of the sailing, like the winds will go and do what they do. But being able to manage and navigate yourself through those winds is, it's not enough to know that you are the ship that is sailing, that is, strong, but can you expertly manage yourself in ways where you are not standing in your own way anymore?
Yes. I mean, radical honesty,
Yeah.
so much so. And there are times when that is so deeply unflattering and humbling, isn't it? Like,
Yeah, it's a lot of me telling myself, you're annoyed at the situation because you're highly irritable, but is this anyone else's business but yours? Like, is this a you problem to manage, You get to that
yes.
place of like, okay, like what is me and what's real and and you get better at that as you love yourself more because you're like, okay, I accept myself. I don't think I'm a bad person because I have these flaws, but we should manage them better. Help our
Yeah,
lives.
right. And I think for me, there was something in that radical honesty, both about seeing the flaws that hadn't been seen, but also the reverse of that. I think for me, with my superego, the false self, there'd been a lot of, there's something wrong with you, you're not okay. And so the honesty, I think, is also about seeing the okayness in us that we've
Yeah.
been missing, as well as the things that, yeah, are less fluttering and there's something coming to me about then the false self, it seems, swings between I'm inferior, I'm superior. When that dissolves, then we're in this place of, well, I'm neither of those things. And I think there's something really liberating in that when we're not having to hold ourselves as either superior or inferior.
It's back to that binary thinking of you're either good or bad, you're either inferior or superior. There's levels and hierarchies to things to, oh, wait, we're all complicated. People are complicated, life is complicated, and we merely exist in contexts that sometimes are beyond our control and sometimes we can control. And that deepening of perspective and seeing yourself and other people from a deeper perspective that's not just like, well, people are bad or good, or I'm bad or good. So when things happen to me, it's because I was bad or good. You start to see like, okay, well, it's much more complicated than that. Going back to my early years working, like, yes, it could have been a bad situation and people were problematic, but so was I. I definitely didn't help in that. And so you really start to see more of the textures of things that then, yeah, alleviates that shame, that anger, that frustration you have with yourself. You see yourself as a human that's complex and other people as
Yes.
human.
I mean, for me, one of the biggest things about this whole process is how much more human and humane we become in it. I mean, I think it is a deeply humaning process. And for me, we touched into the sense of it being a spiritual process as well. What's your sense of that? Looking back at that now, how would you characterize the spiritual part of this?
I liken it to the way cult members lose their spiritual concept because one at the time I felt like not only was I losing a self concept and a sense of the world that I had previously understood, it also affected me to the level of my belief systems. Um, my belief in who I am, this good person. I don't make mistakes. I am good all the time and I'm And I even this notion of goodness was pure, like in the religious sense of like I was pure and I was good and the world is bad. And it's akin to how one faces the world when their belief system in maybe a god or this afterlife or this sense of how one must be and what reward system that comes with, it shatters you to the level of that. Like it's such a rebuilding of who you are that feels religious because of it. I, in hindsight, can see that it was a spiritual awakening of sorts. I know that word gets tossed around very much so like Dark Night of the Soul, and without a lot of people fully grasping what that means. But I think that once your belief system gets triggered or recalibrated or hurt in some way, you really don't know what's good and what's bad anymore and what goodness and badness, think about a word, really is just from this self dissolution. Because a lot of, I think, our sense of self is rooted in a very specific belief system. And so if you are raised religious explicitly, it's much more clear what's happening there, where you frame how to live based off of these rules that you've been giving, based off this religion that you believe. So what you believe about yourself and what is rewarded, what's good and what's bad, does get tested here. In the same way that someone that is removing themselves from a religious concept may feel.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point about how deep the dissolution goes,
Mm.
because it really is about our belief in everything, including the beliefs that we don't know we have. So I think there would be many people listening to this who would say, well, I've never really been religious. But as you said, there's so much culturally that is still operating in that way, even if we don't frame it as specifically as religion. And certainly for me, it was the raising of all of that down to the ground, like all kind of burnt up or dissolved. And then starting to have felt experiences of things that weren't operating on the level of belief. So experiences of love, experiences of, what you just referred to as spiritual awakening.
I think I like the idea what you just said of like beliefs that you didn't even know that you had. And I think for me that was activated through romantic relationships at first, more specifically because up until then I was very sheltered and I grew up in environments where it was, you go to college, you do this stuff and your life plans out a certain way. And like, that's just how it is. There's no questioning of that. And so when I left, university and I was in the real world, for about lack of a better word, and I was experiencing people and I was experiencing myself feel certain things for people that didn't match this world that I had come from and having to reconcile with, well, this person doesn't fit into my worldview and my sense of things. They never went to school. They didn't have these accolades. They don't have these things, but I'm drawn to them. And seeing my emotions expressed to this person and seeing them as a human started also cracking at like my sense of what a good person or someone that's worthy or worthwhile looks like, that made me not understand that like although I thought of myself as this good person that thought of everyone equally, I obviously didn't. I have these preconceived judgments of people that was being like addressed in that way.
Absolutely, that makes complete sense. And my sense of this is that process, if you like, doesn't end.
No.
And there's a when we talk about this new ego or that unfolding or unraveling, that continues on, I think, in subtler and subtler ways over time.
Yeah, because I think one thing that also happens because as much as we're talking about this in terms of, you have this false ego, it's confronted, and then it kind of dies, and then you rebuild a new, more realistic ego. It sounds like very clear cut and defined, but as you know, this is a very diffuse process. So even if at the beginning of the sort of realization that this is my false ego, I was lying to myself, I wasn't real with myself of who I thought I was, the initial realizations and the way that I see it is like over the years, I've started to realize more and more things that I don't think I could have initially handled, the first go around. So I was getting the realizations that I could handle as I could handle them. Because maybe at the beginning, what I needed to realize was, okay, I'm not this good person that is beyond reproach. I make mistakes. I have my own judgments. I, I have this hierarchy and expectation. I am problematic too. That was maybe like the first level of realizations. And then as the years have passed, I'll have certain flashbacks and moments of like, oh, wait, you were additionally problematic to this even more complex level that I think my brain protects me. Our brains protect us of the different layers of what we realize. It's not all at once, it's, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's my sense of it too. And I'm reminded of what you said about the raft, the raft becoming this sailing boat that, what you can handle on the raft is actually not very much before, it's going to capsize. Whereas
Yeah,
when you've got, decent, solidly built boat, there's much more capacity in it. And that's
yeah.
absolutely my experience that the realizations keep coming. There's just more capacity for them and less, yeah, that they rattle us less in that sense because we're used to them coming.
Well, we have a foundation where we don't like, I now know that the realizations I'm having even now post the the core of the dark night of the soul are realizations that I can have because I have a more solid sense of self. I am on that boat. I can handle a lot more. Because I think of moments where I'm like, okay, yeah, I had my own judgments. I wasn't this non-judgmental person. But then maybe I realized, okay, like how I in some moments judge people. But then now down the line, now that this information given to me will not shatter me, I also can be even more critical of how I made other people feel uncomfortable, made other people not feel able to confide or trust me because of my own, like, I could see myself for even more of the problematic layers that I think that you can only get those realizations when your mind knows that it won't completely, like, you're much more solid actually in who you are. It won't completely rattle you. You can then see it as like, ooh, okay, we need to work on that.
Yeah, exactly. I think when something in us knows that they won't fundamentally damage our psychic integrity, then they come in. Yeah, that's my experience too. I've just got one more question, if that's okay. I know we could
Completely
carry
okay.
on for hours with
I
this.
know.
But is there, for anybody who's right in this just now, is there anything you'd like to say?
You are doing much better and you're much further along than you realize. You may seem and feel like you are behind because part of you at the beginning of this process is still seeing things in this like binary good bad. But the reality is that you're like one lap behind, actually. And to get to this place where your sense of self is being shattered, you feel like the worst you've ever felt, you feel like you've taken 30 million steps back, is actually the beginning of the rest of the real life. Like you are being reborn, actually, and it hurts. You're going to feel like goo. You are going to be broken down like a caterpillar before you become this metaphorical butterfly. But that means, yeah, it's going to feel like you never learned, you never grew. I mean, similar to what you were saying at the beginning of, you did go to therapy for many years, even, before you had your dark night of the soul. You may think that this whole time you had really addressed and worked on things, and now you're really feeling like maybe you didn't even know anything, you never knew anything. In between those moments of self-hatred and shame and anxiety and overwhelm, just know that this is the first time you've ever been real with yourself. This is the first time. And it's, similar to Plato's allegory of the cave. This is the first time you're seeing light. It's going to burn. It's going to hurt. You've never been outside of that cave before. But the moment your eyes start to get adjusted, the moment you start to get your skin and everything gets adjusted to being, and you're going to be able to see how beautiful this work is, how beautiful you are. And you're going to learn to love yourself in a way that you couldn't before, but you have to just hold on. This is hard to see, but the first in many steps towards being really who you are meant to be, even though it doesn't feel like it.
So beautifully put. Absolutely. Onyi, thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
with me today. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you for having me. We talked a bit before this, and so I got to know a lot more. I think what this podcast is amazing. This conversation is amazing, especially in a world where there's so much mental health information that's so oversaturated, and people don't really talk about the nitty gritty. They talk about it in terms of like, I experienced my dark night of the soul, and now I'm doing amazing. It's like, okay, let's talk about what happened, what the actual process is. And I love that you're doing. This is amazing. This is an amazing addition to a very saturated and confused space. Yeah.
Thank you.